Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our MAR Talks Revolutionary Mothering series. I'm Carrie Cavers, founder of Moms Against Racism Canada. And this month, we are talking with some pretty amazing people who embody revolutionary mothering. And revolutionary mothering means to challenge the status quo, to protect and nurture the vulnerable, to build up communities that are systematically torn down. So much of what the Indigenous peoples here in Canada do is revolutionary mothering of this land. And I am so grateful to them and their stewardship, time immemorial, of the unceded lands that I'm privileged to live on as an uninvited guest here in the territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And in MAR, we're educating moms and those in mothering roles in anti-racism, cultural competence, and decolonization so we can work together to dismantle racism. And our guest today is a racism dismantler, a revolutionary motherer, and a change maker. Dr. Lisa Gunderson is an award-winning educator and founder of One Love Consulting, an equity and anti-racist consulting training business, where she works with grades K-12 and post-secondary institutions. Locally to Victoria, BC, she is very active in Black communities and in school districts 61 and 63. In 2019, she was one of the BCCPAC representatives to the Ministry of Education led Funding Model Review Inclusive Education Working Group. She is a registered clinical counselor and an inactive licensed psychologist in California. She also provides clinical services and supervision at the Klewanook Tribal School in WLSS. A former tenured U.S. psychology professor, she's taught courses in Victoria's secondary schools, colleges, and universities, and so much more. Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for having me. I so appreciate it. And I am also coming to you from Lekwungen speaking territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And I, like you, am just so humbled and honored to be able to be on these lands where since time immemorial, people have been fighting and dismantling and disrupting racist systems and systems. So it truly is it's truly an honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So for this series, we're asking each of our guests, each of our revolutionary mothers, the same three questions. So if you're ready, I will hit you up with the first one.
Sure.
So what does revolutionary mothering mean to you?
So I should start by saying I have two boys. And right now their ages are 18, soon to be 19, and 14, soon to be 15 next week. And for me, revolutionary mothering is a couple of things. One, it's mothering without a box. I don't mean being outside the box. I mean that there literally is no box. And it really is about, in my opinion, following your child. And what I mean by that is I really believe that each child is gifted with certain passions that is unique to them. And if all of us were able to really foster those passions in our children and have systems that didn't take those away or make them doubt them or not give them opportunities or access to really blow them up, I literally believe the world would be at peace because all of us would be working in the spaces that we were intended and put onto the planet to do. And so part of that revolutionary mothering for me is that challenge of just watching and trying to encourage their passions despite what society is telling me that they should be, despite what my own background or what I'm thinking they should be, like they have to be a doctor, they have to be this. I'm first generation African-American and I have Jamaican parents. And so I went back and forth between the two countries. Patois is my first language. And there are certain ideologies that come with various groups, right? And various people about who you should be and what it should look like, etc. And so even though what I'm saying may seem easy in a way, like, follow your child, I really think it's a challenge. Teachers tell you who your kids can and can't be. Your friends tell you, their friends tell them, they see things on TV that tells them. And so for me, that revolutionary piece is breaking all of that away and just going with them. And if you do that, it just does this amazing thing for your life, whether it's a certain type of sport that they play that you would never have ever thought of, a certain type of activity that they engage in that you're like, what? Where does that come from? So I have one kid who's totally into airplanes and aviation, and I'm just blown away. And another kid who just loves to build and Legos and this kind of stuff. But then both of them played basketball. I never played it at all. I'm just like, right? These things just open up windows into their souls and to their spirits. And it's exciting and goes against the grain, I think. So that's part of revolutionary mothering for me. It's about following your child and nurturing those gifts and passions that you see coming in them as they grow, right?
It's so poignant. And I think that, like, with that whole idea of human potential and the boxes that were put in, like you say, what would that world look like if we all had that opportunity to live what we are passionate about? And I think, like, I extrapolate that too from individual kids to schools to communities.
Yes. Imagine if a school was designed in a way that kids got to share those gifts, right? And all these kids are coming together and what they would be able to create. It would be amazing. So when I was a prof, I would give an assignment, for example, but I would have multiple assignments, multiple choices, and always give a student the choice to make up their own within, and you get things that you just never would have thought of because it's not part of, your space, right? And it's just blows me away. It is really, and I've seen the reverse. I've seen when we've seen kids who have certain gifts that they're not supposed to have, or it doesn't fit the box and people tap it down. And it really leads to some mental unwellness. Kids get anxious and depressed, or they don't want to go to school, or they're frustrated and all these things. But then they do something they love and it's like, whew, it's just revolutionary.
So then in what ways, so we kind of got a bit of a snapshot of how you parent. So in what ways do you practice revolutionary mothering? And this could be within your own family parenting, but also with the work that you do with the schools or with the communities. Because I know you're so active in so many things. And even just as a little side note, like my appreciation for our relationship and how you give me advice and that sense of mothering from friend to friend as well, and mentor to mentee. So
I think I'm going to start there because I appreciate our relationship as well. And I think one of the things with sister friends and any kind of affinity groups is that we have times when we're friends and times when we need that mothering, right? Oftentimes we think of mothering just as being a parent, perhaps to a child, or a caregiver to a child. But it really is, for me, deeper than that, because really what's in the definition of mothering is that love, and it's that care, and it's that willing to hold each other accountable, right? It's when things aren't going well or I misstep, that you're willing to correct, right? That knowing that it's embedded in the space of just wanting to grow. And for me, ultimately, mothering is about really wanting more for that person than you could ever even imagine for yourself, right? And so we see that in our relationships with each other. And I think as we grow from children to adults, we end up missing some of that. And that's why it's really important for us to have those connections. And translating to children, how important it is for them to have real good friendship connections and relationships with people is one of the ways that I foster that revolutionary mothering, right? Really trying to get them connected to their cultural and ethnic spaces, especially because those of us who come from, equity deserving groups or racialized or minoritized, we often have things that we have to deal with, whether it's racism or sexism or ableism, and being able to create affinity spaces for ourselves where we can go and have a safer space where we don't have to explain things to people and understand the microaggressions. We don't have to address that. And we can just breathe differently. And that's one of those things. Teaching my children at a young age to make those connections within their own affinity groups, but then also across groups, right? Like across friendship circles, and just having really good, solid friendships. People who are that you can trust, and people who are not going to engage in lateral violence. So part of revolutionary mothering for me in a very practical sense is talking to my children about what makes up kind of toxic relationships and having those conversations. And if a friend is making you feel a certain way, it's not like we're always happy. We'll get mad and upset and we have to deal with that. But if somebody's really doing something that is, I say soul sucking, right? Like you don't need to be in those spaces. And that happens to us from birth all the way through life, right? And part of that revolutionary mothering is giving kids certain skills that they're going to need. I call them life skills, life lessons. So I'll say to my kid, okay, what mama's about to say right now, this is a life lesson right now, because it means it's applicable now, but you need to know this for all your life. That, versus the lesson for this moment, this day. And I think building those kind of, I call them critical skills. Some people call them soft skills. I don't like that. They're these fundamental skills that I wish we taught from K through 12, like how we demand English. I would demand social justice courses. So teaching these skill sets of equity across all our different identities and fully owning and accepting who you are and being able to bring that into your space. So I encourage that in my kids. My son might say, oh, I'm weird by that. I'm like, no, you're not. You're you. And I love you. And you always go out with you, and just that little simple thing versus going, oh, well, yeah, maybe. People don't understand like that sets seeds, right? But I'm like, you don't define, my kids are biracial by ethnic. And so I say to them all the time, you don't let others define who you are. Not me, not anybody. You own who you are and you take that, right? Nobody gets to do that for you. And I think those kind of skill sets, that's kind of one of the practical ways that I do that. Community building is really important. So getting involved in community, I think, is very key to revolutionary mothering, because when we don't get involved, our voices aren't heard. So I've always been a part of my kids' PACs. I try to be part of the provincial type PAC or the district wide PAC, because especially when you are part of a community that's not well represented, if we're not sitting at the table, not that we're homogeneous, and I really want to make that point. I don't represent we're Black people we are diverse in all ways, languages and origins and, religions, etc. But I do know there are some things that go across the board, no matter where we're from, as people of African ancestry, Black African ancestry. And our voices aren't really heard. And so building that becomes important, and it teaches your children see that. So I get them involved in them voicing for themselves and building for themselves. So if you want a group of young guys to talk to who are your background. Let's make it happen. And, you know, and they did. So teaching them to participate in your community because your voice is important and it's critical and you deserve to be there. And then if it's not there for you, help make it happen, right? So I think those are some of the ways practically of being a revolutionary mother. I hope that's helpful.
100%. And I think it's been interesting just for me, and because all of this stemmed from the book Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines, which is a co-edited anthology by Maya Williams, China Martins, and Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And so many of those stories speak to that, like what you were saying, with where there's the absence, it's then build it.
Yes.
And it's that, and in some cases too, that remothering of ourselves, where there was that absence in ourselves, then building that.
Yes. And I think one of the key pieces to that, and I'm going to speak to this just from my own historical background in space. So I come from, we believe, the Ashanti tribe from Ghana area, and we were kidnapped, enslaved, and brought over. And so my ancestors were brought to the West Indies, and then my parents came to the US. They met in the US. And so both my African American history and my West Indian history becomes very important. In that transatlantic slave trade, one of the things that happened is families were ripped apart. And so Black mothers were purposely separated from their children and put on different plantations in different spaces. And so one of the outcomes of that is we ended up having to recreate mothering for other children and for those that are in our community. And that the long-term effect of that, right, is we have aunties and uncles, and I feel responsible. I'm going to mother you. It doesn't matter if you're not my biological child. My kids just are figuring out some aunties aren't biological. I go, you didn't figure that out because she originates from Laos. So I'm just wondering what happened. And it's like, no, that's Auntie Salsa. It's like, yeah, okay. I thought that was your sister. I go, because she is my sister, right? But it's that idea of we don't have to be blood to be family. And it doesn't matter who you are or what shade we are or anything, that we are going to take care of each other, protect each other, care for one another. And if we're not doing that, we're not living up to what our ancestors did for survival and what was necessary. And so that kind of, when you talk about that missing mothering piece, that's what I was saying. It's so important that we really think about and remember our history. That's, I think, a critical piece of understanding how we engage with one another, that we can, mother each other in a way that's not, that's important, that those that are missing, that there is home, we can build that community with one another. And I think we live in a society that doesn't necessarily think of mothering that way. They think of it very individualistically. And in fact, if you get too involved, you're a helicopter parent. And there's all these negative connotations if you don't just let your children go, which is pretty amazing thought when you think about, like I think about our historical cases of us letting our children go when they were ripped away from us. We don't let our kids go ever. If they're 80 and I'm still alive, they're still our children. And you're always going to be my sister, no matter how old. That stuff doesn't get old. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. I don't know.
100%. Totally makes sense. And I love it. I love it. I think it's so important. And I appreciate that I've found that with you. So thank you.
So welcome.
Our last question, what advice do you have for those wanting to be allies and dismantlers of racism?
Yeah. So I don't quite believe in the idea of allyship, because I think it kind of ends up taking responsibility and accountability away from dominant groups and puts them back on to our groups. So instead, what I challenge people to do is ask yourself, how can you be a dismantler, a disruptor, an abolitionist of any of the systems that are in your circle, in your world, right? And so if you indeed do that, then you are going to be able to do what's necessary to help create a space where we can all then, if we're all working together, get rid of these systems, right? So what I would suggest when it comes specifically to the idea of racism are three things. First, when I spoke at Black Lives Matter rally, I always say this, and Mars people know this, you can't be Switzerland, right? You have to make up your mind that you are either going to engage in behaviors, thoughts, actions that help to disrupt, dismantle, or abolish racism, or you're engaging in stuff that helps to systemically continue them. And that may just be something as simple as just talking with your kids about incidents that happen. It's the kind of books you have in your house where you're teaching your children to be equitably minded. And that brings me to my second piece, which is don't teach your children to have color erasure or what they call color blindness. I think that's an ableistic term. So teach color equity, right? Like we all have a race, we all have an ethnicity, we all have a nationality. Learn the differences between those and teach those to your children and teach them to be proud of whatever they are and not to judge others. Not no one way is better than another in terms of our racial identities, right? But don't teach your children to not see that I'm, for example, Black. It's beautiful and I love it. And it means so much in terms of my history and who I am as a person. So you can't combat racism if you don't believe race exists. It's kind of hard. So if that makes you feel uncomfortable, then you have some learning for yourself that you need to do. And go ahead and do that. And there are a million places you can go to find the information you need. Mars does that. You can Google information, listen to podcasts, go on Twitter, watch certain TV shows, listen to certain music. It's everywhere. But it's going to take your time and your effort, and you can do it as a family. And you start with, for example, learning whose territories you're on, right? And what does that mean for your family and where you're at? Because almost all of us are immigrants here, unless you're one of the indigenous persons, you have indigenous history here. The other thing I would suggest is remember your history. So learn your history. That becomes critically important. While you're learning all other people's histories, learn your own. So every one of you should be able to identify at least 3 anti-racist abolitionists of your racial background and heritage. So if you, for example, are white, name 3 white historical anti-racist, abolitionists, dismantler, disruptors, people you model, in addition to those of other backgrounds, and have all of those people represented. And if I just asked you a trick question, you're like, oh, I don't know any. Got to go learn that, because that's what you got to teach, right? That's how you help in this space. And remember, you're never alone. So at the end of the day, remember your history. Remember, you're never alone. People have been fighting this fight for hundreds of years. They will be fighting it after we're all gone. And you may feel like you may be alone sometimes, depending on where you are at work. Maybe you're the only one talking about this stuff in your friendship circles and things like that, but you're not. There's so many of us out here. And so I really recommend connect with those people, because we're always learning. I'm always learning. And you have to do this together. No movement for equity ever was done by itself. It's always done, starts with a small group of people and then grows. So just remember, you are in great company. You are in great company.
Wise words, wise words. Thank you so much, So thank you very much, Dr. Lisa, for all the revolutionary mothering that you do with your family, within Moms Against Racism, and within our community. The world needs these radical acts of love. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having the series. It really is awesome. It really is. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.